Welcome to the Fifth Nine. Yeah, it's pretty awesome to have a lounge space here, huh? A lounge space for SRE and DevOps type people at Fifth Nine. It's pretty cool. So my name's Luke Stone, and I work at Google on customer reliability engineering, which is it's a part of SRE. Thank you. It's a part of SRE that is focused on our customers' applications. And here I have all the people from Home Depot who graced us at Next this year. And we've been working with Home Depot to get their website, homedepot.com, which is a big e-commerce website, to get it running on Google Cloud. And I wanted to give them a chance to tell their story about what their experience is of building stuff on Google Cloud, and how they do metrics, how they do, multiple zonal resiliency and stuff, and their experience with, CRE and building an SRE team. So I want to hand it over to William, who is the director of SRE for Home Depot and is responsible for keeping Home Depot online. William?
Well, and the only thing I'm going to say here is Luke and I just did a previous session, so I don't know if anybody was in that session, and I promised a few people that we would answer more detailed questions. So I wasn't the really deep technology guy to answer those questions, but we got Jay, Kwong, and Kumar, who are SREs at Home Depot. And if you guys have some questions, they're going to talk about a few things that you may find of interest, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. All right, without further ado.
Here's our agenda. Our agenda, real quick, is Kwong is going to talk about Valet, which is basically Home Depot's version of SLAs, and Kumar is going to talk about zonal resiliency and their interconnection with their on-premise environment, and Jay's going to talk about CRE, SRE. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kwong. I've been working with the Google Cloud Platform project at Home Depot for the past 2 years. We are not only leveraging the Google Cloud Platform and putting microservices on the cloud, but actually we have been transforming our web engineer into SRE. Well, the best way to learn is from the best Google SRE. So we have adopted many of the principles and concept from Google SRE. One of them is the SRO. We require all of the microservices before going to live to have a well-defined SRO, and the responsibility is between the SRE and the development team, and that could mean reaching out to other stakeholders.
So how many how many microservices do you have?
We probably have about 70. Yes.
Wow. So you have to kind of keep the SLO somewhat standardized across all of these microservices.
Yes, we do. We have 5 key metrics to our SLO. We call it Valet, which is volume, availability, latency, and error. And then the last one is tickets. And most of these we get it from our logging system. And we're using SLOs for tracking and monitoring. Also, every week we going through all of the SLO or incident to see if any of the service is breaching the SLO.
So what happens if a service goes out of SLO?
We're going to have an SRE and a development team to deep down and find out what's the problem and resolve the issue. And many of the new microservices, before it's going live, we require going through a slew test of load tests and destructive tests. And basically what it does is helping the SRE and the development team to understand the service better. And based on that, either they adjust the SO before it's going live, or making change on the service to make sure that it's below the SO
Yeah.
requirement.
So at Google, the tradition is like if you miss your SLO, then like if you go out of SLO in a month, then you basically stop pushing new features, and you shift your work over towards reliability. You know, everybody has a backlog of reliability stuff that they can chew into. Do you guys do anything like that?
Yeah, like I say, we are transforming our culture and to be a SRE. So yeah, we start enforcing some of those. I mean, you know, we're not getting there yet, but I mean, that is the culture that we are moving forward. Yeah.
And so do you require people to like create valet metrics before they launch their service?
Yes, like I said, yeah, before any microservice, before it's launched live, we require to have a well-defined SLO. And then, like I said, before it's going live, we went through a load test and destructor test and make sure it met the SLO, or potentially that's when the time where they adjust the SLO to make sure that it's met the requirement.
Who's the decider on what's acceptable for the SLOs?
Well, like, we have a stakeholder, and mostly on development team, and then that's why I say SRE and the development team work together to agree on certain SLO.
Nice. So, do you like roll these SLOs all up? I mean, because there's also like volume in there, which isn't really an SLO thing. But do you roll them all up to make a composite score?
Currently, we don't. We look at it as a separate. So any of those are breaking, then that is breaking a SLO. So right now, we don't have a one composite number.
So, like in Google SRE, we have an idea on tickets. You know, I guess we have more of a rule of thumb that you shouldn't get paged more than twice in a shift. Is that somewhat what you use for
Yeah,
tickets for?
we right now default we have one or two tickets on most of the SRO, but I don't think we strictly applying that right now. But I mean, it's something we probably, like I say, it's a culture that we probably going to start enforcing more as we go.
Nice. And so how do you, so when you have a service that has latency that because it depends on another service behind it, how do you figure out what's appropriate latency? Or how do you measure that latency?
Yeah, I think all the dependency, so the latency is depend on also aggregate with all the dependency. So if your microservice latency is like 100, and then if it's beyond above that, and that including all the dependency. So I mean, we don't, we just take an aggregate as a whole. Yeah.
It's just baked in the whole thing.
Some of it's, I mean, some of it's handled by like circuit breaker patterns, and even where we've had to adjust SLOs for, you know, like lower level dependencies, because we found that, hey, you know what, when we've got a customer facing API or service that has a dependency, and it's got to call this service, so we can't achieve our availability for this service if your SLOs are this loose. So we've had to tighten some of those up to make sure that we could still hit our overall availability, especially for customer facing components.
Yeah. So I have a question. This is probably somewhat sensitive, but do you have any services that are chronically out of SLO?
Actually, we used to have it, and then we actually changed the SLO up.
That's a good technique sometimes. Just make the SLO reflect reality,
Right.
get back into SLO, and then start incrementally.
Right. But I mean, we did talk back to the other stakeholder, and then they all agreed. Like I say, sometimes the dependency is taking much longer than we anticipate, and that's why we're changing it.
Yeah.
And I think PIP is one of the product that we are about to roll out in a few weeks, and I think before it's launching, and it's constantly go beyond our SRO. So that's why the SRE team and development team constantly try to make the improvement before it's actually go live. So I mean, before go live, we did a lot of tests and load tests to make sure that the SRO is met.
Nice. Yeah, I think it's pretty impressive to see their whole system because they have, they basically have a dashboard that they can plug in all of these SLO metrics into that then their business stakeholders can just use this dashboard and they don't have to, do what some people have to do at Google, which is then go look at the SLO and try to figure out what it means and how it's defined and dig and dig and dig and dig. It's all really very clear at Home Depot. It's pretty cool.
I forgot. So these are sort of like some of the items that typically the SRE and development team have to go through and come up with. So typically we have a stakeholder and then the due date, like typically before the launch date. So we have to have all these defined before the microservice can launch. So let me just go here.
And
so
the microservices are they're pretty similar, right? They're all web-based.
Right.
REST kind of
Yes.
API services.
Right. So here is one of the sample microservice that I have here. So every week that we going through the service and make sure that all of them met the SRO. And in this particular service, if you look at that, that is sort of like a volume. When we start out with the service, we assume that there should only be around like 450 requests, but obviously that is way off. But that's actually is a good thing because actually we can handle much more than we anticipated. So
this is actually an application that we built to help us track our SLOs. So I mean, we're using Stackdriver for most of our monitoring, but it's not great to use for tracking your SLOs over time. So we built a system, and it takes inputs from a variety of some from ultimately from our logs in BigQuery. We extract data out of those, and then push it into gather your aggregated metric and push it into this application. But that also allows us to expand this beyond just our Google application. So I mean, the inputs can be generated from wherever. So we can even use this for our critical systems that are in our on-premise environment as well.
Cool. Cool. Is that basically any last thoughts?
no, I mean, basically, I mean, like I said, we are trying to change the culture. We're not just leveraging the Google Cloud Platform. We are changing the whole engineer to become more SRE, and some of these are new for us. So we continuously gonna keep improving in this.
Yeah, it's cool that you're using data-driven approach. And it's not just you're not winging it. You have some real good hard numbers behind these decisions. All right, thanks, Kwon. So Kumar, you want to tell us what's on the next slide? You were gonna tell us a little bit about HomeDepot.com global architecture, right?
Yeah. So I'm Kumar. I'm the principal engineer at Home Depot, and I work closely with the SRE team. So this is a high-level 10,000-foot architecture for application hosted on GCP. So there are other components, but for the sake of simplicity, we have omitted it, and this is like a basic stack of what an application deployed on a Google Cloud looks like. So if you look at this on the extreme left, there is an on-prem service which kind of tells you that we are in a hybrid model. There are services which are hosted on Home Depot on-prem, which talk to Google Cloud applications through the public internet. And on the right-hand side, you see the browser, which is the customer traffic, which is, again, obviously coming through the internet into the Google origin URL. So what we have is, if you guys attended the last session from Luke and William, so this is actually a double click on that whole episode or session, and Mahesh, right? Yeah, Mahesh spoke about HTTP load balancers. So we use HTTP load balancers. So all our requests go through a central global HTTP LB, and they get load balanced across multiple zones and multiple regions. So we run on 2 different regions, East and Central, and 2 zones in each region. And so one thing which you can see from this diagram or picture is that you don't see any cross arrows. You don't see any arrows which is going from East 1B to East 1C or from East 1 to Central. So basically, that's our pattern for zone isolation, where we restrict traffic to a particular specific zone for two purposes. One is it reduces latency and improves performance because your traffic is within the zone, and also reduces cost because you're not paying egress costs for going to a different zone or a region. More importantly, it helps us route traffic for failures. So if a specific service is not functioning or if it's down on a zone, then the LB detects that it's down. The health check on that LB for that service fails, and the service is routed to a different zone. Or if there is a region failure, it routes to a different region. So the only cross-zone or cross-region traffic, as you can see from the picture, is the database. So we use Cassandra for SR data store, and that data has to be replicated across different zones and regions, so all the apps have the same state they're talking to, right? But once the LB determines that which zone is going to serve the traffic based on the geolocation, it stays in that zone. Unless there is a failure in which it goes to a different zone. So that's the basic architecture. So we have so we use Nginx web tier. So that's our all our requests go through a centralized web tier or web layer, and we have microservices for each service. So the requests go from Nginx to the microservice Tomcat layer, and from there to the DB. There are other components. But this is the basic architecture which we have for all our applications. So most of the things I've touched on here. Okay, so the health check is there at the LB level, which will route to a different zone or region in case of failure. We have no cross-zone communication except for database replication. So Nginx is the backend service for the global load balancer. So that way, if a zone goes down, or even for that matter, if you want to test something on a specific zone, we can just shut down that Nginx, and LB will automatically detect that the LB will automatically detect that health check fails on that zone, and then it routes the traffic to the other regions. So the fourth one is kind of interesting, adjusting the load balancing mode to send traffic to all the zones. Well, so with our pattern of on-prem, sending on-prem to the Google Cloud, right? All our on-prem infrastructure is hosted in central regions. So the request which comes from on-prem hits only the central zones. Now what happens in that case is that all the infrastructure which is provisioned on the other region, the east region, is underutilized. And when we get some amount of high traffic, we auto-scale on the central zones, but the east ones, they never get utilized, right? So one of the things which we did recently is that we adjusted the load balancing mode, which allowed us to send traffic to all the zones, even if the request is coming from a specific region. So so that allowed us to be more effective in our cost and not auto-scale unless it's absolutely necessary. And for internal traffic, we use a service discovery tool. It's from HashiCorp. We use Console, which is again zone isolated. So when we have a service-to-service call in a specific zone, we use the service discovery tool allows us to only get the IPs for that zone. So which does not allow us to do a cross-zone or a cross-regional call. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
So, what are the steps you take when you're setting up a new microservice?
So, are you asking about what do we use to deploy, or?
Yeah, like what components do you need to change to add a microservice?
So so when we add a microservice, the only thing which we do is we deploy the microservice. So we have a CI/CD pattern or a model which deploys the microservice, and then we add the context to Nginx. And if there is any associated backend or data tier, then we deploy that. So we go backwards. We first deploy the backend component, and we deploy the microservice, and then update Nginx to send traffic to it. Yeah.
Nice. And how do you roll out a new version of a microservice?
Yeah. So so we use managed instance groups for all our deployments. So if you want to roll out a new deployment, basically a new version, we deploy a new MIG, a new managed instance group, and which basically has the same service name, and then the traffic is sent to both the old and the new instances for a period of time before we shut down the old instance groups, and then we have traffic only on the new version.
Nice. So are you pretty happy with this setup? Is there anything major that you would change?
Yeah, well, it works for us for now. But there are some things actually we are looking at. One of the things, it works for stateless applications where all instances are similar. But there are some scenarios where we don't want to send traffic right away after the instance comes up. We want to do some kind of, I mean, we do health checks, but more than health checks, right, we might have to do some validation. Or like specifically for data tiers, right? We might want to do some auto warming or some caching, and make sure that there's warm cache before we send data to it, right? So for that we are working on a different model where we deploy the instance, do health checks, and then send traffic to it, which is a different pattern than what we are using right now. Yeah. So.
Like more robust health checks, more than is really capable with HTTP load balancer or even console. I mean, significant validation, right, of the service, that the data is valid, that we just fed into it, that kind of thing.
Right. Makes sense.
So actually, when we deploy, it deploys to each zone. So I mean, an engineer deploy to one zone, and then if it's good, it roll to the next zone, and if it's bad, then we just roll out. So I mean, we can do each zone at a time, so we don't have to do it at one shot.
So do you have your dev teams do the rollouts, or is the SRE team always doing the rollouts?
For production today, it's mostly SRE, but I mean for low life cycle, it's automatic. We have a CI/CD that automatically deploy once the code committed. In a low life cycle. But in the future, I think we want potentially that development can even do the deployment themselves as well.
Nice. That's awesome. That's kind of one of the SRE principles that we like to kind of remind people of is always have the dev team do some portion of the production work, so that they're so they know about it, they have their hands on production, they're aware of it, and then they can sympathize a little bit. So Jay, what's your experience with setting up SRE in Home Depot and working with CRE?
The CRE engagement that we had was really eye-opening. I mean, we did a lot of there's a lot of literature about SRE. I mean, probably most notably, the book that Google SREs wrote. But sometimes it's hard to take those practices and really apply them, and then even when you do successfully apply them, I mean, really making sure that it's achieving what you expected it to, right? That you haven't left gaps, and not just with that, but with our our entire architecture. I mean, this was we've spent a little bit of time doing this, but there's obviously a lot of things that you can think you got right, but when you actually encounter an unexpected failure mode, or there's a lot of things that you can find that hey, we thought we had it right, but we didn't. the CRE engagement was extremely valuable for us, I think. Just to kind of recap, I know probably some of you heard William and Luke's talk earlier, but Google CRE came and worked with our teams for at least 2 or 3 months, something like that.
It was like August until
Maybe it
Black
was longer than
Friday
that,
at the
yeah.
end of November.
It was an extended engagement, and basically, CRE sat down over multiple meetings, really poring over our multiple aspects of our architecture, how we did deployments, how we were monitoring things, how we did service discovery, how we were load balancing. Really dug deep. I was really, actually shocked. With how much they were interested in not just how we were using, Google Cloud components, but actually how, the open source software we were using and were we using it effectively, and what risk did those introduce, and did we have proper mitigations for those. Really dug deep into all aspects of our platform, our architecture, and provided extremely valuable feedback. It was a little bit terrifying, I think. I mean, as like part of the team of guys that made a lot of the decisions about how we were going to do this stuff, and exposing all of that, and really having to talk about it with experts that you kind of feel maybe at a different class and a different used to a different scale. It was but it was extremely extremely valuable. They really showed us some things that were some problems that we hadn't anticipated, hadn't thought about, but really more than that, really showing us how SRE should engage with providing that model for how our SRE team should be engaging with our development teams, with our app teams that are building these things, and what kind of reviews we should be doing with them. I thought was probably the most valuable out of it. I mean, the technical issues that we found and the gaps that we had, obviously that helped a lot. But really showing us how to do SRE, I think, was the biggest thing.
Yeah, that whole deep dive was led by our tech lead, Matt Brown, who's like right over there.
Yeah.
And we had to learn a whole bunch of stuff too, because we don't run Cassandra at Google,
Right.
So
Console.
we had to kind of figure out how to analyze these things kind of from first principles. And Matt came up with a good rule of thumb, which is that we would look at the API between your system and Cloud API, right? Which is kind of like the API is, well, sometimes it's actually an API call, but sometimes the API is basically POSIX, if you're running on a VM or whatever. And then Matt's rule of thumb is then look one layer deeper, in levels of abstraction. So we kind of understand, oh yeah, Cassandra sits there and runs on a VM, but actually what's it doing? What's its purpose? How much data is it going to push over what links? Is it going to be quiet and then all of a sudden bursty, or like what's going to happen with it?
Right. Yeah, it was like I said, it was really great, and the depth with which you guys went into not just the Google things, not just how we were doing instance groups or how we were using the load balancer, but really that extra step that I think provided the biggest value. I mean, I think William mentioned it earlier. I mean, I've been involved. William's been involved with a number of consulting engagements and with other vendors, right? And this was by far at least in my opinion, was the most useful one.
Yeah, before we started, we were kind of trying to tell William what to expect, and we said, William, this is not the white glove treatment. This is more like the rubber glove treatment.
Yeah,
it
was.
And it was cool.
That's what I said. It was a little bit terrifying at first, right? I mean, of like, man, we are really gonna, kind of put all our cards on the table here, and have people really pick this apart. But I mean, it's better, obviously it's better in advance than doing this with your with your CIO or something after a major incident, right?
Yeah, that's kind of our, that's kind of the idea, is that while you have postmortems and you will continually improve if you use postmortems correctly, you might as well start off at a pretty good level, to begin with.
Right, absolutely.
So how has it affected your engineering culture to have an SRE team? Because you're pretty new within your organization.
It's obviously. I mean, I think we kind of alluded to it. I mean, it's still a little bit incremental. I mean, we're still trying to get better and to do things a little bit better every day, right? I mean, and that's I think that's the biggest thing is just we've kind of had it's the way, at least in my experience. I mean, I've been with Home Depot for a while, and really being able to establish SLAs and say, what error rate is okay, right? Is this a problem? I mean, kind of historically we've kind of, well, it could be better, so let's keep it better, right? I mean, and really having that establishment of, well, okay, what's really the number that we care about and the numbers that we need to achieve for our business, and then as long as we're under that, then we don't have to worry as much, right? I mean, that's a big change for us. I think that's really adjusted our mentality, and it's kind of helped to make the kind of the operations SRE role a little bit more sustainable, right? I mean, which is important because I mean I've been doing this for a while, and it's a lot of times it's been extremely taxing, right? I mean, I'm sure we could share war stories for a while, but I mean it's been a lot of kind of always on, a lot of burning the candle at both ends, trying to get things done, keep things up, get things ready, and for anybody that's it takes a toll, right? You can only do that for so long.
Have you noticed any significant changes in your development velocity?
I probably I haven't really tracked it that closely. I mean, I think that we probably have. I think that especially for application teams, and we've kind of provided a kind of the paved road of, hey, here's a pattern that works, here's a model that works, and if you kind of follow that path, things will generally be pretty good for you, and you won't have a lot of trouble. And certainly once an app is launched, I think that we have and it's not just SRE. I mean, I think that it's a number of principles. I mean, of solid testing and just our overall kind of software engineering practice is also kind of changing at the same time that we're implementing SRE, and that's definitely provided us a lift in how quick we can get things rolled out.
Yeah, I noticed you guys centralized your CI/CD. You have an engineer, Christo, who's like, making a really great CI/CD platform that all the dev teams can use, and you kind of got out ahead of the problem, and so now everybody just uses it, and it's like solved.
Yeah, and as long as you use that and you follow a few, I mean, not overly constraining practices. If you follow that, then it's pretty easy to get your app running and to deploy new versions of your app, and it just kind of works, right?
So one thing William was mentioning was how your strategy is, you have this monolithic legacy architecture that's sitting on-prem in your data center, right? And your strategy has been to kind of bite off one microservice at a time and implement that microservice in the cloud, right? And then, you just imagine like you just take a class and move it to the cloud, and it's in a server, and then you just call to it over an RPC. How's that work for you?
It's been a journey that we've been on for a while of breaking components out of our monolith and using deploying those separately, even in our on-prem environment. We've been kind of on this journey for a little while. Definitely moving it out of your data center adds some additional challenges, right? I mean, what was maybe a few milliseconds of latency now becomes I think we've got roughly 40, 50 milliseconds of latency to our services in Google. So that's been a little bit of a challenge of how do you manage that, and so you have to kind of carefully plan how you're going to move components and move their dependencies, and Do you move a backend API to Google before you move the front end, and then have your customers kind of ping-ponging between the components? I mean, sometimes the unfortunate answer is, I mean, sometimes we have to do that, right? I mean, it's just we've got to be able to get the service out running. We've got to make sure that it's actually functional. And the only way to do that is to put customer traffic on it. And if we have to eat a little bit of latency in there, then we make that as a kind of an informed decision and say, hey, it's going to be the state we're going to be in for a little while. And other times it's well, we don't really have to do that. We can move the front end as well, and maybe move both components at at the same time. So it's kind of a case by case thing of how we're going to do that. But yeah, in general, I mean, it's worked pretty well. I think it's a good model.
How do you decide how big to make the microservice?
That's a great question. I mean, definitely, I think we've got some that we've kind of feel like maybe are maybe smaller than they should be, and I think we've definitely got some that are kind of larger than we would like them. But that's an evolution, right? I mean, I think especially once we migrate and it becomes relatively easy. I mean, on-prem we had creating a new cluster, deploying a new application. There was a lot of process and a lot of things you had to go through to do that. It just didn't, there's not an API you can call and get, a new set of servers racked, right? I mean, you had to, sometimes it was procurement, sometimes it was, multiple teams that you would have to go through to get them cabled and get firewall policies and all that stuff. I think kind of our, at least my opinion is that, once you've migrated the app, even if it's bigger than you wanted it to be and wasn't perfectly sized microservice, textbook, whatever that is, that you can always come back and break it down later and divide it up as it makes sense. And it's much easier then because now you've got a system that's basically designed to change and adapt much more fluidly.
So if you've got like 70, 80 microservices, you're going to have a lot of logging and monitoring streams. How do you keep this stuff all straight?
Well, I mean, I don't know that we've hit it out of the park on all of it. We're definitely using Stackdriver for our core metrics, and we've had to get creative with some things, right? I mean, we're using also using Stackdriver, Google Logging, and Fluentd Agent to push all of our log streams into Logging API and ultimately into BigQuery. We've had a few challenges with having to get our data structured well enough that we could actually utilize it effectively and be able to run queries against it. And then we built tools, like we were mentioning with the Valley dashboard that we had there that shows the aggregate metrics. I mean, we've built tools to make it easier for big queries to get run. Basically an API that you can call to run the query for gathering an hour, 2 hours, or a day, or whatever whatever time frame you need of the metrics for that application, and then being able to expose it in multiple ways, right? Chatbot or being able to push it into a long-term kind of aggregated metrics like the Valley dashboard. And then we've done some things with even with the Stackdriver collectd that we're still working towards actually having our applications emit the metrics. So we got creative with some of the things that were capable there and did use like collect detail plugin to scrape our real-time metrics that we wanted out of the log files as well. We're working on obviously working on trying to improve that and make it more scalable. It's got a little there's a few problems with it. It's a little more hands-on than we want it to be. So we're trying to come up with new and creative ways to gather that without having to have such a dependence on logs.
Yeah, I like a couple things you did seemed pretty smart. There's some Slack bots that you built. that would put a bunch of stuff into a Slack channel, so people could just kind of like watch the Slack channel, and you'd have a pretty good idea what's going on.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah, and we've used that fairly effectively. I mean, and it's basically the same. The Sitebot's relatively dumb. It just presents the data, but the actual application that we wrote that we call our TPS reports, right? Which is basically it just goes out and you can feed it an application name and a time frame, and it will go generate your go query BigQuery for that and provide back the data. And I think even in some cases it actually notes that compared to the SLO. Of what the application's expecting, so you can clearly see if even on a 1 hour time frame or a custom time frame, whatever you want, is this app healthy? Is it okay? And anybody can query that. I mean, it's available to the whole company, right? I mean, anybody can join our Slack and run those queries.
The other thing I thought was pretty cool that came up when we were doing a Wheel of Misfortune one time was you had your deployment script log everything that it was doing to BigQuery. So you could kind of go into BigQuery and be like, okay, when did this deployment start? Who did it? What's going on here? That was pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, that's a more direct integration. So we use Fluentd on our nodes to collect the logs, not just our application logs, but other syslog and other general logs of interest. But our deployment tool actually logs directly to the API, and it actually is very clear about what you can see exactly what the deployment tool is doing, even if you're not sitting in front of the screen running the deployment yourself, right? I mean, it's fairly real time to see what's going on there.
Yeah, that's cool. So, what technologies are you looking forward to? What are you gonna adopt as soon as it becomes GA?
I don't know. I mean, we kind of worked around the lack of internal load balancers early on, and so that's one thing that we've been considering. Should we revisit that? Should we look back at the since the internal load balancers are GA now? Should we evaluate using that instead of our kind of homegrown solution that we used? Other than that, I don't know. I mean, Spanner looks really cool, but there's I could probably geek out all day and say. And as a matter of fact, we've had through our engagement, we've had so many Google product teams wanting like, hey, we've got this thing that's coming. Would you be interested in doing testing with it, alpha testing? We'd like your feedback. And I mean, it was kind of like you could definitely get overwhelmed with the all you can eat, because then once they ask you to do that and you say, oh yeah, that sounds cool, and then they want feedback on how did it work and what did you think and all that. So it's kind of you can definitely overload on that. So yeah, so XPN is something that we've been interested in. So right now we've kind of got some growing pains. Within our project, we're kind of consolidated with most of our applications all in one project, and we've run into some problems there with with API quota limits, and some of those are soft limits that we can get raised, and some of them are like, no, we really can't change that for you. So we're considering XPN and using XPN to allow us to spread our services out over multiple projects, still communicate internally and fairly openly and freely across that, but to be able to decompose down to multiple projects.
Nice. So I was wondering if we had any questions. Yeah. Yes, please do. I think this is a great time. We got about 12 minutes left.
So during the keynote this morning, your Home Depot guy mentioned that you have moved parts of the data warehouse into BigQuery, and then he avoided an answer about the problems that you were having.
And if our SVP avoided it, I probably will too. We use BigQuery in our operation mainly for log analysis, and we've got a few other use cases we're using. We have another team that's doing data warehousing, and they could probably answer your questions much better than I can. I don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he avoided the answer in order to say why it not succeeded, and then he was talking about looking for talents and working on interesting problems and so forth.
This is Shashi. He's also an SRE at Home Depot.
So we have two teams. One of them is being our EDW team, warehouse team. They started using BigQuery. I don't recall them mentioning any issues with that. We are e-commerce team. Make sense?
Especially when it comes down to, let's say, unpredicted queries. So these join issues and these kind of things, there is not really an issue performance-wise. So performance is good from your point of view? Yeah?
So
From e-commerce point of view, like you're asking about the select queries, whether when you're doing some views on top of it, how is the performance of the BigQuery and all that stuff. For our reporting, e-commerce reporting purposes, logging reporting purposes, whatever the queries we are running, we do not see any issues as of now.
So the one area where we use BigQuery is that all our transactional data gets fed into BigQuery through a internal job or a process, and the production operations, they never go to our transactional data store to query something. They go to BigQuery, and it's working out pretty well for us. So.
Okay, so before we had the SRE book, we had the testing book from Google. So I'm wondering how the SREs interact with the software engineer testing teams.
Shashi again.
So we do have a performance engineering team. They do all the stress tests on our microservices. And now what we have transitioning that into SRE teams. So now SRE teams and dev teams, we are empowering them to do their own stress tests so that when they deploy the service, before deploying the service, they can do the stress test, load test, check their SLOs, value metrics, and all that kind of good stuff. And then once they get a green signal, it's part of the CI/CD flow. That's what we are planning. And then it will get a green signal, and then they can go to production.
So you mentioned you have a large monolithic on-prem system still running. I wonder what criteria you use to peel off functionality from the monolithic system to build these microservices.
So I'll take this opportunity to plug my boss's talk tomorrow. So he's actually going to talk pretty extensively about this. But
I'll ask him a second.
But I think the kind of the short answer is based on what's easiest, right? That's where we kind of started with this. Was what were the easier things to separate? What were the and additionally, what things? What components of the site did we want to be able to update more rapidly than what it was really feasible to do with the monolithic components? So those were probably the two kind of core things.
How much you spend on automation versus operations?
I don't know. I don't know if I have a good hard metric on that. I would say that probably too much time on operations right now. I mean, I think we really want to get more to automating. I would say probably 50-50 at worst case right now. I mean, I think that a lot of our time is.
Yeah, it probably started off with 20-80, maybe 20 automation and 80 operations, but I think we are right now close to 50-50. I think we are getting better. There is more automated deployments and automated processes which we have in place. So one of the things which we still need to work on is automated tests. We are not 100% on that, so we still have to do a lot of manual validation. So that's something which we're working on. Yeah.
Hi. How do you divide application support across the teams? So how is the application architecture itself divided among the teams in terms of support?
architecture or just support?
The product itself, how are the applications divided?
Sorry, can you repeat one more last sentence? Last
Yeah.
one.
So, the system is divided. The product's divided into multiple components.
Yes.
And SRE teams are handling, managing, maintaining, and supporting these components. My question is how many components or how much of this product is divided between teams? So how many application does each team support?
Oh, you mean each SRE, how many applications it
Yeah.
supports? There is no hard and fast rule for it. It depends on the velocity of the changes. It depends on the critical nature of the application. So we have primary SREs, that's what you were talking about. So primary SREs, secondary SREs, and then one SRE will be on call, that kind of operational issues. But there is no hard and fast rule for that. One application should have 10 SREs or 5 SREs. There is no rule as such. It depends on the application.
Okay.
I mean, we do kind of generally bucket our applications up between what we kind of call the browse components of our site versus the like cart and checkout components. And so we have separate SRE teams that, I mean, they work closely in conjunction with each other, but applications are generally bucketed towards that. Obviously, I mean, we've got a lot that kind of fit the middle ground. I mean, they're not perfectly one or the other. I mean, they're maybe shared or whatever. But generally, we assign them to one team or the other, and then within each of those teams, there's multiple SREs that kind of divide those up with expertise on each one, deeper knowledge on each one.